Hello, we are researchers from the U21 Autism Research Network, and we're here in this video to share with you some insights that we've gained about autism-related language preferences.
So firstly, what is the U21 Autism Research Network?
We are a network of autism researchers across the globe working together to ensure our research is more inclusive of a global autism community.
Great. So why did you choose to investigate autism-related terminology in your first collaborative study?
Well, this is a really contemporary issue in autism research at present. Language we use to describe ourselves and others isn't just descriptive. So through language, we provide our stance on a particular topic, or we provide support for the preferences of the community about which we're speaking. And in the autism domain, what we see is that this focuses on what we call identity-first language, so speaking about an autistic person, as opposed to person-first language, so using the term person with autism. But these language debates have recently extended to encompass other autism-related terminology, including things like functioning labels, and also the way we talk about non-autistic people.
And why did you want to take a global approach to studying language preferences?
Well, crucially, studies to date have only considered the language preferences of those in the UK and Australia. But rather than assuming that these preferences reflect those held globally, we should investigate the preferences of a diverse set of autistic individuals from many different countries.
Excellent. So can you tell us how you answered that very important research need?
Of course. So with the help of our colleagues from around the U21 Autism Research Network, we managed to recruit 654 English-speaking autistic adults from across the globe who completed an online questionnaire which asked them about which terms they were happy to use to talk about autism, and also the reasons underlying these preferences.
And the 6 categories of terms that we asked them about related to nomenclature, referring to the person themselves, referring to diagnostic status, broader conceptualizations of autism, referring to their abilities, and referring to non-autistic people.
And what were your findings?
So firstly, I'm going to talk about the quantitative results. Regarding the nomenclature of autism, we saw that the most popular term was autism, with around 90% of respondents saying that they would be happy to use this term. In contrast, terms like Asperger's syndrome and autism spectrum condition were considerably less popular. For referring to the person, we saw a preference for identity-first language, with autistic person and neurodivergent person coming out as the most popular terms. In contrast, we saw that terms like person with autism and person on the autism spectrum were considerably less popular. For referring to the diagnosis, we saw that is autistic and is neurodivergent were the most popular. For referring to autism more broadly, we saw that participants quite liked terms like neurological difference and disability, and they really didn't like terms like disease and disorder. For referring to the abilities of autistic people, we saw that terms like differences, difficulties and challenges were highly popular. In contrast, terms like deficits and impairments were very unpopular amongst our survey respondents. And finally, when talking about non-autistic people, we found that the most popular terms were neurotypical people and non-autistic people, and considerably less popular were terms just like typical or typically developing people. Notably, on the whole, we found that these terminology preferences were very consistent across the countries we sampled, with all countries showing the highest endorsement of the same terms.
And what about the qualitative findings?
So we received 414 open text responses when we asked our participants to tell us more about their autism-related language preferences. And through a process of reflexive thematic analysis, we came up with 6 main themes for the data. So the first theme, problems of differentiation, addresses participants' stance on terms that are used to segregate autistic people. So for example, using terms such as high and low functioning in some domains are actually inaccurate and therefore harmful and divisive. We are different and not less describes participants' view on deficit-based language, and that this is harmful and inaccurate, with many of these so-called deficits arising as a result of being placed within a world that was not built for autistic people, as opposed to being due to any inherent deficiency within themselves. The third theme, autism is me, links to repeated emphasis by participants that autism is an integral part of who they are and that it cannot and should not be separated from them. And being autistic was an elementary or large part of one's identity, and this really explains the emphasis or preference for identity-first language. Claiming language and community describes that because the language we're talking about is about autistic people, it's autistic people, therefore, that should be leading the way in deciding what language we use to describe them. Participants also showed a reclamation of certain terms like disability, and this allowed them to be part of a broader community that gave them access to reasonable adjustments. Be concise, be accurate, and be specific linked to many comments we had about terms such as neurotypical and non-autistic, and how these terms aren't synonymous, and so we need to be aware of that in the language we use. And finally, respect and hear our voices really emphasises the fact that at the centre of our decision for terminology and language should be the voices of the community.
So, what were the main take-homes from this research?
Well, it's important to say that no language is universally preferred, and therefore we should ask the autistic individuals we interact with about their preferences. When we're in scenarios where we can't ask someone about their preferences, it may be a good idea to use the terms that were most popular in this research, such as identity-first language. It's also important to think carefully about the way we describe characteristics, for example, avoiding functioning labels. And finally, we should always try to use language that is respectful and empowers the autism community.
And any final points you think are worth our listeners being aware of?
Yes, so I think it's really important to note that the language we use to talk about autism itself has changed a lot in the last 10 years or so. And so it's really important that we ask autistic individuals what their preferences are in the moment, because those could have been changing or could change going forwards compared to the research that we presented to you today. It's also important to note that we sampled autistic adults in this research, and that doesn't mean that the preferences are reflective of all stakeholders related to autism. So again, it's just really important that we think about individual preferences and speak more about language and ask each other our preferences.